case I've tweeted that. Hello everyone, it's Melissa Sweet here from Croaky Blog, and I'm at University of Canberra today to be talking just justice and some of the issues arising from Dondale. Now, can you please introduce yourselves?
I'm Wayne Applebee. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Canberra. I did my undergraduate in Justice Studies.
I'm Paul Collis. Just completed a doctorate in Cultural Studies. I'm Aboriginal from Burke.
Hello, my name's Holly Northam. I'm a nurse midwife academic at the University of Canberra. I've just completed my PhD looking at organ donation decision making for families at the time of a death.
And you have an interest in trauma and justice?
I have a great interest in trauma and justice and giving voice to the vulnerable in the healthcare system.
Great. Now, Wayne, when we last met up, you mentioned that the Dondale story had brought up a lot of personal issues for you, reminding us that, you know, Dondale in some ways isn't exceptional, but part of a much bigger story of institutionalisation. Can you expand on that for us?
Yes, that's not a problem. As a very young person, I was taken away when my father died, and also my brother. This is back in the early 60s. I was placed in what's called at the time was St Helens Boys Home. I was there for about 18 months and then was released, went back home, and then after that I went back into another place called Mount Penang, which was at Gosford, and had some terrible experiences there. What it reminded me of is this Dondale incident was pretty well much what used to happen back at Gosford, very, very similar. But the subtleties were slightly different there. Most of the punishment would come from other fellow inmates because the system was so designed that the inmates would have to compete, like attain so many points in this point system that if you didn't reach that, the whole group would be penalised. So they wouldn't receive cigarettes, that sort of thing, or extra privileges. So the other inmates, if somebody failed, they would be the ones who would actually inflict the punishment on the person that failed the whole group. So there was things like holystoning, which was something that came from ships. Back in the old days when they had wooden ships, they had to clean the decks with these huge stones. These stones would weigh about 20 kilos, very, very heavy. And you would have to holystone, like it was called the deck at Gosford at that time. And you would holystone that. What it would do, it would wear away the skin on your knees so that you'd actually wear through to flesh. They'd be bleeding, but you wouldn't be able to stop. Otherwise, they'd inflict physical violence on you. So they're the sort of things that recall for me. The only difference I noticed was between Dondale and Gosford was that they used hoods. From what I understand about hoods, the idea behind that is not to stop spitting. What I believe it is to put the person who wears the hood in fear of their safety because of the violence that can be inflicted on them from whatever direction that could come from. The individual wouldn't know where that violence might come from. And from personal experience, violence is not a new thing. This has been going on since I was a kid. I'm talking back in the 60s till today. So, from my experience, there's nothing new here. There are issues that I am concerned about. One of those is that we, way back at a Royal Commission, and this was under Bob Hawke and Paul Keating, they instituted the Royal Commission, which brought out
The Black Death in Custody.
Black Death in Custody, 339 recommendations, and they were all recommendations to be implemented. You can count on one hand how many were actually implemented. But what is worse, those that were implemented were never policed, and they are not being policed today, like video cameras to watch the incarcerated while they're in their cells. There's too many cases where those video cameras haven't been working, or that's the pretext. Anyway, what brought me to university was the fact that a person called Dumaji got killed, in my view, on Palm Island from what was said to be a simple fall over a stair. But the injuries that he sustained, like ruptured portal vein and internal injuries from a simple fall, just don't equate with the outcome. This is more likely someone who's fallen or been from a great height or been in a plane crash. So these are the sorts of issues that worry me, that we're not going to get to the guts of this. We shouldn't be talking about recommendations. We should have, out of these Royal Commissions, we should have laws instantly put into place to stop these things happening. So I'll leave it over to me fellows here for their comments.
I'd like to know, are those prison officers, I don't know what they call them in the Northern Territory, are they still working? Those guys that hooded him and bashed that boy up against the wall and threw him to the floor and took his trousers off him and waterboarded those others, are they still on the job?
No, there's issues that should be looked at here. There are human rights for people that are juvenile. Why are these human rights being violated in the way they are, and no penalties against these people inflicting this stuff? And we need something done about it.
The other thing with those kids in custody in Northern Territory, I was reading that 60% of those Aboriginal inmates are there on remand. They're on bail issues.
Yeah.
They haven't even been charged. So once again, the issue around lock them up, forget about them, throw away the key, do the crime, do the time, all these stupid little hurtful, throwaway comments. Given that not only being Aboriginal are they vulnerable and marginalised, but they are young people as well, and that in the Aboriginal community or across the Australian community represents the highest percentage of people that are dying of suicide. So it's good. So these boys that have been traumatised by jail, and jail is a very traumatic experience. You either survive it or you don't survive it, and when you get out you may not survive it well. I taught in jails for about 12 years at Mount Penang and in other places, Maitland and Cessnock, with Aboriginal prisoners. One of the saddest parts of that experience is that a lot of the Aboriginal prisoners, I'd ask them, these were guys that were doing long-term or what they'd call repeat offenders. They were, some of them would say, I'd ask, how long's a long time outside for you? He said, 12 weeks, 3 months. So they learn to survive a system, but not to survive life. You don't learn decision making. You don't learn any of those things around normality. The
other thing is violence begets violence. If people go online, find that some of the people that have been there become violent killers themselves because they've been subjected to violence. Tamworth Boys Home had a fearful reputation. When I was a young kid, anyone who went there, they would come back emaciated, they would be starved into submission, never allowed to speak. These are the same people that went on in later life to become murderers and killers of all sorts. Whiskey A Go-Go was one place I recall where a whole range of people were killed by one of the people that actually went to Tamworth. So
long reaching arms, isn't it?
Yeah. Can we just go back to a point you mentioned, Wayne? The only thing that was different from your experience with Dondale was the use of the hood. And I just wondered if Holly would like to comment on that, because you mentioned earlier, Holly, when we were talking whether such devices are actually necessary from your experience? Can you
Thank you for those questions. Yes, I think that we've got to be really careful that we're actually blaming victims in the system here. So we're looking at a whole more holistic way and linking what's happening to youth in detention with the healthcare system and their health and well-being and how their health and well-being is managed. So if we look in the healthcare system about how do we respond to the threat of spitting, if you're a healthcare worker and you have a patient who might be at risk of spitting at you, this is not uncommon for all sorts of reasons. So we have protective strategies which are to protect the staff that are working in the facility, but also to protect the well-being of the person who's in need of our care. And so, we might wear goggles, we might wear protective clothing where these risks exist. And we have to change the way we are looking at the criminal justice system and incarcerating juveniles, because we know it's impacting on their physical and their mental health and well-being and their long-term human flourishing. And as a society, they are our victims, and we have to be accountable for the fact that they are in this situation because we have created the environment that has put them there. So as a healthcare worker, I think that we actually have to start taking responsibility. We can't blame the victims, we can't blame the people who have been put into these situations. We actually have to look at what we are doing to improve the situation for people, not just throwing money, not just tokenistic, but actually be accountable in our individual relationships with people and with the system. So looking at some of the international best practice, clearly things aren't working properly in Australia. We have much evidence to show that imprisonment isn't working. What are they doing overseas where things are working better? How are they approaching some of these justice issues and healthcare issues in a different way? Canada has some good examples. Other countries have good examples, New Zealand. To reduce incarceration, to reduce the cost to the system, the huge costs that are spent on jailing people without any benefit. And we must move beyond the political rhetoric.
Yeah. The rehabilitation side of it in Australia is becoming a bit of a joke, because there's more Aboriginal people in jail now than at any other time. The Royal Commission on deaths in custody saw it as a real major issue, the number of Aboriginal people, but it's now 4 times the number now than what it was then.
One of those recommendations, Wayne, from that Royal Commission was that Aboriginal people should be jailed at the very last resort when nothing else is available. But that has not been used. It's probably not been used across the board. It's certainly not been used with Aboriginal people. Again, that comes back to this stereotyping of blackfellas, you can't trust them, because they're not like us. They're sneaky. So we can't put them on an anklet or a bracelet. They'll just break that, or they'll whatever. So you're lost before you even start. You're lost the game before you're even given a chance to play in it. And that's that thing about that recidivism, coming back into jail, giving up. Suicide is a real thing in our communities. Some of these communities, it's not unusual to have two suicides on the same night. And then in those remote communities where they're related by blood and by other means, you might have repeat in another community or another couple of communities.
Cluster suicide, they call it. Yeah. The other thing is, we should be looking at other places around the world, like in America and Canada. They're looking at justice reinvestment, which is, instead of building jails, put the money into the communities and provide jobs and opportunities, and try and get these kids into work or into programs that can actually do some good for them. We've talked about this for an awful long time in Australia about justice reinvestment. We talk, but we never actually get to do it. Like in the ACT, we built a jail here, and they've continued to expand it and expand it and expand it. All the time, we could have had a program like justice reinvestment. It's a perfect location for it in Canberra, a small community by comparison to the larger cities in Australia. We could actually have a model like that working up and running now. I just fail to see why we haven't done it.
I believe there may be opportunities now to start, in Canberra particularly, to start questioning how we approach these things, and there is a move to using restorative justice principles in the system, and this is an ideal opportunity to take these sorts of questions and question elsewhere. You know, is mandatory sentencing appropriate? How much ability does a judge have to be able to make a valid decision, taking all the information that's pertinent to the situation? And should the goal be just about blaming and punishment, or should it be about healing the person and returning them to society?
That's what it should be.
And do we need to
Therapeutic justice is what it should be. Instead of incarcerating people, try and work out what the problems are and deal with the issues, the medical issues around it. Try and build that person, rebuild them, give them an opportunity in life. Instead of brutalising people that are for sure, like I've said, places like Tamworth prove that what you can get, if you brutalise somebody, they'll come out much worse than what they went in there.
Absolutely. So could I just go to each of you and ask you, what's the really key message you want people to take away who are watching this, or policymakers? So just, one real take-home message. So Paul, if it's right, I'll put you on the spot first. So here we have Dr Paul Collis, for those who are just joining us, Canberra University.
For me, the most recognised thing that's happened with the Dondale, with the hooding and bashing of those kids up there, is that the whole country, Australia as a whole, has said, no, we're not that kind of person. We don't want to be that kind of people. We want that stopped. We didn't have that when we had the Royal Commission into black deaths in custody. Back then, in the 80s, early 90s, that was a black issue. But this thing in the Northern Territory is a national affair. That's the one big thing, but we can't leave it there. As Wayne said, you've got to take it on. You've got to take it on with vigour, and you've got to take it on with intelligence, and admit that it's not working.
Thanks. I'll go to Holly next, if that's all right. So Wayne has the last word. So Holly, what's your takeaway? So Dr. Holly Northam, nursing midwifery academic at University of Canberra.
I see that the way we're handling the juvenile justice system, particularly if the example of the Dondale Centre is lazy governance, it's lazy regulation, it's victimising people who are already victims, and we have to be accountable as a society for our children. These are our children. We have laws that we, as health professionals, that we have to do mandatory reporting when we see that somebody has been abused, a child in our care has been abused. We are abusing the children that we are actually accountable to care for. So we have a responsibility as a society to take accountability and to be responsible for changing what's happening, because it is our fault that we have this problem. We cannot blame anyone else.
Thank you, Holly. And Wayne Applebee, who's a PhD candidate here at the University of Canberra.
My issues are these. We had a Royal Commission long ago with 339 recommendations. Very few implemented. I don't want to see this coming Royal Commission go the same way. What I want to see is, instead of recommendations, make laws out of these Royal Commissions and make them law immediately and have change straight away. Because if we go down this road again, it's just another talk fest, another Royal Commission with no outcomes. 339 recommendations and a handful have been implemented. This is a travesty because people are suffering from this. That's my take on the whole issue.
Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. It's been really good to hear from you as part of our Just Justice series, and I'll just turn off the camera.